Hey guys, so tonight we're going to talk about China, Japan, and a little bit about Africa, mainly just the imports and exports that were coming into and going out of Africa. For China and Japan, we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at the dynasties or the rulers who were in China and Japan after 1500, what the state of those areas looked like, and how they were trading and interacting with the rest of the world. So let's go ahead and get started. So first we'll talk about China. During this time period, China has two dynasties is under two different ruling, I will say families. So first is the Ming. You see on our map here where the Ming dynasty borders are compared to modern day China. It's pretty sizable, but not the full extent of what we know as modern day China. And then the next is the Qing dynasty. It's spelled with a Q, but it said Qing. And it is essentially all of what we know as modern day China and even part of Russia up there. And so these two dynasties are the ones that exist after the 1500s and are going to shape the trading policies that we are going to learn about. So let's get started. So the Ming dynasty in China doesn't emerge until 1368. And before the Ming dynasty, China had a bunch of warlords that were feuding over power, and the Mongols were still in China, and so that was causing a lot of unrest in China. So the Ming dynasty emerges when one of those Chinese warlords, Hung Wu, is able to expel the Mongols, and he establishes the Ming dynasty. He is a peasant who is really poor, but he rises to power due to his military feats, and when he takes power, he restores old traditions like Confucius moral law. He focuses on agricultural reform. He reinstates the civil service laws that have existed in China for forever and ever and ever, which help choose officials for their government. So he really establishes or puts in place some procedures for the Ming dynasty that are going to stabilize that dynasty. So he is the one who starts this dynasty and really stabilizes it. Next, we're going to talk about Young Ha. We talked about Young Ha a little bit, and he was in that video, the Crash Course video that I showed you all when we were talking about European explorers. In Crash Course, they were comparing him to Columbus. Young Ha is arguably the greatest explorer. He, compared to Columbus, his voyages were huge. He led 7 sea expeditions that went all the way to Eastern Africa. On these 7 missions or voyages, he gets 16 countries to pay tribute to China. He shows China's prestige and greatness by giving away gifts of silver and porcelain. Not only were they successful voyages, but they were huge. They were really enormous. The Crash Course video did a great job telling us about how huge his ships were compared to Columbus. He traveled with a fleet of, it was over 20,000 people in his fleet, and he took scholars and artists and politicians and religious men. He took all these different types of people with him, not just explorers and crewmen, and it was more like a floating city to show the rest of the world the prestige of China. So he was really important. And as he's doing this, as I said, he gets 16 countries to pay tribute to China, which means that they pay China to show that they're being submissive to the authority of China. They do this because it allows them to trade with China and allows them connections with China, so hopefully they can continue to trade with China because China had a lot of things that people wanted. So Young Ha's voyages were really important, and they really set the stage for China and the demand for Chinese goods throughout the world. However, by 1433, some of the government officials are a little upset about the money being spent on Young Ha's voyages, and so they put a stop to those voyages, and that really ushers in the age of isolationism that we see in China and that China is somewhat known for. So, like I said, in 1433, the policy of isolation begins in China. So what this means essentially is that the Chinese government tries to restrict trade between European countries. They only allow trade to happen in 3 port cities. You can see them below. And they only allow trade with the Dutch and the Chinese. So they expel all the other Europeans, and they refuse to trade with any of the other European countries. They did this for a couple of reasons, but mainly because trading and mercantilism, which we'll talk about in our next video, but essentially merchants, who are people who sell goods, we've talked about that term before, they weren't held very highly in Chinese society because of those Confucian morals and traditions that we had talked about. China also placed a lot of emphasis on agriculture. So for these reasons, China adopts this policy of isolation. And this is carried through into the next dynasty that we were talking about with China, the Qing dynasty, which lasts from roughly 1644 until the 1800s. So the Qing dynasty has the same policies. They have this policy of isolationism. They're trying to limit the influence of European countries and the influence of their ideas and their practices in China so that they don't affect Chinese customs. However, trade is still flourishing for the Chinese. There's still a huge demand for Chinese goods, especially porcelain and silk and tea, and trade is happening between these European countries and China anyway. But there is a practice, especially under the Qing dynasty, known as the kowtow. This is essentially that when these countries come, they're expected to pay tribute, like we said, pay the Chinese to have the right to trade with them. And their ruler, the ruler of this foreign country, whoever it is supposed to kneel down before the emperor of China, the leader of China, and bow down and really show reverence and respect and submission to the Chinese ruler. Well, the Dutch and the British are perfect examples of this. The Dutch accept this, they do the kowtow, and they're able to trade with China still. The British refuse to, and China refuses to trade with them. So that, in a nutshell, is what we need to know about China. The Chinese goods were in demand from Europe and other countries. China was trading still, but they had a policy of isolationism, and they didn't want the influence of European countries in their Chinese culture. So next we're going to talk about Tokugawa Japan. It essentially is the borders that we know as Japan today. You can see it on the map. Tokugawa is a leader of Japan during this time, and that's why it's called Tokugawa Japan. It's not necessarily the name of the country at the time, but it's the period. So prior to this, Japan was in what was called the Warring States period. The old system of feudalism that had been in Japan for previously had fallen apart. The country was in chaos. Between 1467 and 1568, there was a civil war that led to this unrest and this chaos in the country. And during this time, the daimyos and samurais emerged. Daimyo is essentially a warlord. So he's the head guy, he's the warlord, he's in charge of what's happening in his area of Japan, and the samurai are his soldiers, essentially. So a bunch of these different daimyos were controlling different parts of Japan. The country was in chaos. There was constant fighting going on. However, eventually, one of these daimyos was able to solidify Japan and kind of get a grasp on controlling most of Japan and bringing most of Japan under unification. It was actually one of his generals, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who in 1603 is really able to completely unify Japan and become the sole ruler or shogun of Japan. So Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1603 gets all of Japan united under his control, and he becomes the sole leader, or the shogun as they're called in Japan. He begins a period of stabilizing Japan, bringing stabilization to this Japanese country that has been in about 100 years of chaos and war and constant fighting. So he begins to stabilize Japan, and Japan begins to prosper under him. Now, in before he unifies Japan under his rule, the Europeans had already come to Japan. The Europeans first landed in Japan in 1543, and so during this time there's no single ruler to really control the Europeans' interactions with the Japanese or limit their trade or their interactions with the Japanese. So, and when the Europeans first come, the Japanese actually kind of like what the Europeans bring to trade, specifically guns and that kind of thing, and they're trading willingly with the European, and this lasts for a period of time. However, eventually the shoguns realized that they didn't like the European influences, specifically religion and the Christian missionaries that were coming to Japan. They didn't like the influence that European culture was having on Japanese culture. They didn't want to sacrifice Japanese culture for European culture. And so they begin a period of isolationism as well. And they realized by 1639, they realized they aren't dependent on European trade. They don't need European trade. They can be an independent country of their own, and they will still be fine. They will prosper anyway. And so in 1639, they initiate the closed country policy, which is just essentially isolationism, a name given to isolationism. And for 200 years, Japan is totally closed off to the rest of the world. Essentially, not totally, but essentially closes itself off to the rest of the world. Japanese people are not allowed to leave Japan because they don't want them to leave and be influenced by other cultures and then bring that back to Japan. And other countries aren't allowed in or to trade with Japan. The exception to this, again, is the Dutch and the Chinese are allowed to still trade with Japan, but only at the port of Nagasaki. That is the only port that is open in Japan at this time. So, like I said, despite this closed door policy, Japanese culture and their economy is still able to flourish and develop. So that is a quick overview of what we need to know about Japan, that they practice the policy of isolationism, and that it was this policy that shaped their interactions with the rest of the world. And lastly, we're going to talk about Africa. And just really quickly, we're going to talk about the imports and exports that were coming in and going out of Africa during this period of time. So we learned a little bit about this in the triangular trade. We talked about slaves as one of the exports leaving Africa during this time. Also, gold was leaving Africa, and ivory. Ivory is what you see at the top of the screen. It's an elephant's tusk. It comes from an elephant's tusk, and it's used to make fine pieces of art, jewelry, trinkets like little chests or little boxes, a lot of decorations, things like that. And it's very expensive. Nowadays, it's illegal to kill elephants for their tusks, so it's extremely expensive, and you're able to find pieces today, but it was extremely expensive even then. So those are some of the things exported out of Africa. Some of the imports coming into Africa, as we had talked about before, were manufactured goods. So Africa hadn't industrialized as much as the European countries had. So anything that was manufactured or made in a factory was brought into Africa to be traded, and especially guns. Guns had a big influence on Africa at this time. Slaves were traded for guns, and this introduced guns to African society, and it really changes the dynamics of the interactions between people within Africa itself. So that's also a little bit of the impact that it had on Africa. Also, slavery had a huge impact on Africa, the continent of Africa. It was devastating. It tore apart generations of families. It took away entire generations of working class, like the strongest people from the working classes in Africa. So it had a really harsh impact on the social structure and the economic structure of Africa, which was mainly agricultural. But in the other sense, there are some side effects, I will call them, of slavery that are positive for American culture. Africans still brought their culture with them to America. That means they brought their religion and their art and their music and their cultural practices. And so they brought these things with them, and we can see today how rich these practices made American culture that eventually emerges. We have African culture and the slaves coming over to them for jazz and blues music in our culture, and just and all sorts of things, foods that we wouldn't have been introduced to, art styles that we wouldn't have been introduced to if it weren't for these Africans who brought their culture with them. So while slavery in and of itself is a horrible thing, and it did devastating things to the African economy and even to the economies in the Americas, I shouldn't say the economies, but the social structures in America, there are some things that came out of slavery that really enriched our culture as well. So that, in a nutshell, is what we need to know about China and Japan and Africa during this time period. In our next video, we'll talk a little bit more about mercantilism.